March 1943. The freighter SS Excalibur * docks at Galveston, Texas. In the hold, 500 German prisoners of war sit in darkness, waiting. They've been captured in North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps, defeated at Tunisia. For weeks, they've survived on minimal rations. Many are sick, most are malnourished. All of them expect the worst. They're Nazis, after all, captured by the enemy. They know what happens to prisoners in German camps. They've heard rumors about Soviet treatment of German POWs. They expect hard labor, starvation, maybe worse. Then the hold opens. American soldiers order them up the gangway. The prisoners climb into Texas sunlight, blinking, confused. They're loaded onto trucks. No one tells them where they're going. The trucks drive through flat Texas countryside, endless fields, small towns, heat shimmering on the horizon. Finally, they arrive at Camp Hien, 100 miles northwest of Houston. What happens next changes everything these men believe about America, because what the Germans find in Texas isn't what they expected, not even close. This is the story of over 50,000 German POWs held in Texas during World War II. It's about what they ate, how they lived, and why many of them never wanted to leave. And it starts with a meal that starving German soldiers couldn't believe was real. Let's go back to understand how we got here. By 1943, the United States faced an unusual problem: too many prisoners. After victories in North Africa and Sicily, American forces were capturing German soldiers by the thousands. The British were overwhelmed with POWs. Someone had to take them. The United States agreed. Between 1943 and 1946, America would house over 425,000 Axis prisoners, mostly German, but also Italian and some Japanese. They needed somewhere to put them, somewhere far from the coasts, far from potential escape routes or sabotage targets, somewhere with space. Texas was perfect. The state was massive, sparsely populated in many areas, and had a climate that, while brutally hot, at least wasn't frozen tundra. Between 1943 and 1945, Texas would host over 50,000 German POWs across dozens of camps. The largest were Camp Hien, Camp Huntsville, and Camp Mexia. But there were smaller camps scattered throughout, near farms, near military bases, near anywhere that needed labor. The Geneva Convention governed POW treatment. Signed by most nations, including Germany and the United States, it set clear rules. Prisoners must be housed humanely, fed adequately, allowed to work for wages, and protected from abuse. The United States took these rules seriously, not out of charity, out of calculation. American POWs were held in German camps. If America mistreated German prisoners, Germany might retaliate against American soldiers. So the policy was clear: follow Geneva Convention rules strictly, treat prisoners well, document everything. Before we continue, if you're finding this story as powerful as we do, please hit that like button and subscribe to support our channel. We're amazed every day by this community spanning continents and time zones. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from, whether it's Berlin, California, or Birmingham. It's incredible to share these forgotten stories with people all over the world. But policy is one thing, reality is another. When the first German prisoners arrived in Texas in 1943, they were terrified. Many had been indoctrinated with Nazi propaganda about American brutality. They expected violence, starvation, forced labor in deadly conditions. Some expected to be shot immediately. Instead, they were processed. Medical examinations, delousing. New uniforms, not American uniforms, but clean clothes with PW, prisoner of war, stenciled on the back. Then they were assigned to barracks. Barracks surprised them. Wooden buildings, yes, but weatherproof. Heated in winter, though Texas winters weren't severe. Bunks with mattresses, thin, but mattresses nonetheless. Latrines, showers, not luxury, but not the medieval dungeons they'd imagined. Then came the first meal. This is where the story gets interesting, because what the Americans served German POWs wasn't survival rations. It wasn't punishment food. It was, by the standards of 1940s military rations, generous. The first dinner at Camp Hien, as recorded in camp documents, roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread with butter, coffee, and apple pie. The prisoners stared. Many refused to eat, convinced it was a trick. Some thought the food was poisoned. Others believed it was a test, eat well now, starve later. The American guards didn't explain, they just waited. Eventually, hunger won. The Germans ate, and then they couldn't believe what they'd just eaten. Let's be specific about the food, because this is what shocked the POWs most. According to Geneva Convention rules and U.S. Army regulations, prisoners were to receive the same rations as American soldiers. Not similar, the same. The daily caloric intake for POWs was set at approximately 4,000 calories. For context, that's more than most Americans eat today. But in 1943, after years of war rationing in Germany, it was unimaginable wealth. A typical breakfast: scrambled eggs, bacon or sausage, toast with jam, oatmeal or cereal, milk and coffee. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute Germans had been drinking since 1941. Lunch: soup, sandwiches with meat, fruit, cookies. Dinner: meat, beef, pork or chicken, potatoes or rice, vegetables, bread, dessert. On Sundays, better meals: fried chicken, roast turkey or ham. On holidays, special meals. Christmas 1943 at Camp Hien: roast goose, red cabbage, potato dumplings, stollen German Christmas bread, and beer. Yes, beer. German POWs in Texas were allowed beer. Not every day, usually once or twice a week, and only low-alcohol beer. But the fact that prisoners received beer at all astonished them. In Germany, by 1943, beer was rationed. Many Germans hadn't tasted real beer in months. Here, in a prisoner camp in Texas, they drank beer with dinner while their families in Germany went hungry. One German prisoner, Georg Gaetner, later wrote about his first week at Camp Hien. "We thought we were being fattened for slaughter like livestock. Why else would the Americans feed us so well? Then we realized this is just how they eat. This is normal for them. We couldn't comprehend it. In Germany, our families were starving. Here, as prisoners, we ate better than we had as soldiers in the Afrika Korps." Another prisoner, Reinhold Pabel, described the shock differently. "The first time they served us ice cream, I laughed. I thought it was a joke. Ice cream for prisoners? Then I tasted it and nearly cried. I hadn't had ice cream since before the war. And here I was, a prisoner in Texas, eating vanilla ice cream on a Sunday afternoon like nothing was wrong with the world." But it wasn't just the quantity or quality of food. It was the variety. The Americans served fresh vegetables, lettuce, tomatoes, carrots, fresh fruit, apples, oranges, bananas. The Germans hadn't seen bananas in years. In wartime Germany, tropical fruit was a memory. Here, prisoners received bananas with breakfast. Some didn't recognize them. Younger prisoners, drafted at 18 or 19, had never eaten a banana in their lives. The camp cooks had to show them how to peel them. Now let's address the obvious question: why? Why did America feed enemy soldiers so well when American civilians were dealing with rationing? When Americans at home were limiting sugar, butter, and meat to support the war effort? The answer has multiple layers, and not all of them are noble. First, the Geneva Convention. As mentioned, America wanted to ensure German compliance with international law regarding American POWs in German camps. Treating German prisoners well created leverage. If American prisoners were mistreated, the U.S. could credibly threaten to reduce rations or worsen conditions for German POWs. It was diplomatic insurance. Second, practical necessity. The prisoners were going to work. Texas during WWAI faced a massive labor shortage. Farm workers, factory workers, construction workers, all drafted or volunteering for military service. The cotton fields needed picking. The lumber mills needed workers. The farms needed hands. German POWs filled that gap. but prisoners need energy to work. A starving prisoner is useless. A well-fed prisoner can pick cotton, harvest crops, cut timber. The food wasn't charity, it was investment. Third, propaganda. The US government documented POW treatment extensively. Photographs of well-fed, healthy German prisoners were sent through neutral countries to Germany. The message was clear: surrender to America and you'll be treated well. As the war turned against Germany, this became powerful psychological warfare. German soldiers on the Eastern Front faced the choice: surrender to the Soviets and face brutal treatment or death, or fight westward and surrender to the Americans. Many chose West. But there's a fourth reason, less calculated and more simply American: abundance. By 1943, American agricultural production was staggering. The US was feeding its own troops, Allied troops, liberated populations in Europe, and still had surplus. Texas in particular was producing massive quantities of beef, cotton, grain. The state could afford to feed prisoners well because it had food to spare. This abundance shocked the Germans fundamentally. They'd been taught that America was weak, decadent, on the verge of collapse. Nazi propaganda portrayed America as a mongrel nation of inferior races, incapable of real production or military strength. Then these prisoners arrived in Texas and saw with their own eyes endless fields of crops, warehouses full of supplies, meals served in quantities they'd forgotten were possible. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Georg Gaertner wrote, "We'd been told America was starving, that the British blockade and German U-boats were strangling their supply lines, that Roosevelt's America was a paper tiger. Then we saw Texas, miles and miles of farmland, cattle ranches bigger than entire German provinces, food so abundant they fed prisoners like guests. We realized we'd been lied to. Everything we'd been told about America was a lie." Life in the camps settled into routine. Prisoners woke at 6 a.m., breakfast at 6:30, work assignments at 7:30. The work varied depending on the camp's location. Camp Hien prisoners worked on nearby farms, cotton picking primarily, but also vegetable harvesting, general farm labor. Camp Huntsville prisoners worked in lumber mills. Camp Mexia prisoners helped with railroad maintenance. The work was hard but not brutal. Prisoners worked 8-hour days, 5 or 6 days a week, with Sundays off. They were paid for their labor 80 cents per day in scrip, usable in the camp canteen for items like cigarettes, candy, toiletries, newspapers. 80 cents doesn't sound like much, but in 1943 it was significant. A candy bar cost a nickel. A pack of cigarettes, 15 cents. Prisoners could buy small luxuries their families in Germany couldn't afford. The canteen itself amazed the prisoners. Stocked with American goods, Coca-Cola, Hershey bars, Lucky Strike cigarettes, soap, razor blades, writing paper. Items that had been luxuries in pre-war Germany were everyday products in a Texas POW camp canteen. Many prisoners sent packages home, when allowed, filled with soap, chocolate, and canned goods. Their families received these packages with disbelief. "You're a prisoner," one wife wrote to her husband at Camp Hien, "and you're sending us chocolate. What kind of prison is this?" The camps also provided recreation. This surprised the prisoners as much as the food. Recreation facilities included sports fields for soccer, which Americans called football, to the Germans' confusion, volleyball courts, boxing rings. Some camps had swimming pools, makeshift but functional in the Texas heat. There were libraries stocked with German-language books, newspapers, and magazines. The camps subscribed to German-language newspapers published by other POW camps in the US, keeping prisoners informed about the war, though censored. The prisoners organized themselves. They formed soccer leagues, camp-wide tournaments with referees and rules and spectators. They created theater groups performing German plays and musicals. Camp Hien had a full orchestra. Prisoners who'd been musicians in civilian life formed a 30-piece ensemble that performed weekly concerts. They played Beethoven, Mozart, Wagner, but also American jazz, which fascinated some prisoners and offended others who considered it degenerate. Educational programs were established. Prisoners could take classes in English, mathematics, history, trades like carpentry or mechanics. The US government saw this as re-education, preparing prisoners for eventual return to a post-Nazi Germany. But for many prisoners, it was simply opportunity. University-educated prisoners taught classes to those with less schooling. The camps became informal schools. Religious services were permitted. Both Protestant and Catholic services, led by prisoner chaplains or visiting American clergy who spoke German. The Americans didn't force attendance, but many prisoners participated, some out of genuine faith, others out of nostalgia for normal life, for the rituals of home. Christmas services in the camps were particularly well attended, prisoners singing German Christmas carols while Texas stars shone outside. One prisoner, Herman Jung, described Christmas 1944 at Camp Huntsville. "We decorated a pine tree, not quite like German trees, but close enough. We sang Still Nacht. Some men wept. We were prisoners, yes, but we were alive, well-fed, warm. We thought of our families in Germany, bombed, starving, suffering. We felt guilty for being so fortunate, guilty for being captured, guilty for surviving while Germany burned. That guilt never left us." The guilt was real and widespread. As the war progressed and news from Germany worsened, cities bombed to rubble, the Eastern Front collapsing, civilian casualties mounting, many prisoners struggled with survivors' guilt. They were safe in Texas, eating well, playing soccer, while their families endured hell. Some prisoners stopped eating, unable to stomach the abundance. Camp doctors had to intervene, treating depression and what we'd now call PTSD. But not all prisoners were grateful or compliant. The camps housed a mix: fervent Nazis, opportunistic soldiers who'd never believed the propaganda, and everything in between. The Nazis among them tried to maintain discipline and ideology. They held secret meetings, enforced loyalty to Hitler, and punished prisoners they deemed traitors, those who cooperated too readily with Americans or expressed anti-Nazi sentiments. Several camps experienced violence between prisoners. Pro-Nazi prisoners attacked anti-Nazi prisoners. There were beatings, intimidation, even murders. Camp officials tried to separate the factions, but it was difficult. The most fervent Nazis were eventually isolated in special camps, but not before causing significant problems. One infamous incident occurred at Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, not Texas, but relevant to our story. In November 1943, German POWs loyal to Hitler beat a fellow prisoner to death, Johannes Kunz, because he was suspected of informing camp authorities about escape plans. 5 prisoners were later tried, convicted, and hanged for the murder. The case demonstrated that not all German prisoners were grateful or docile, and that Nazi ideology remained powerful even in captivity. Escape attempts did occur, though rarely from Texas camps. The geography worked against escapees. Texas is enormous, sparsely populated in many areas, and distinctly foreign to Germans. Where would they go? Mexico was hundreds of miles south. The coast was even farther, and they stood out, pale Germans in a state full of sunburned Texans, speaking little to no English, with no money and no contacts. Most escape attempts were half-hearted or symbolic. Prisoners would walk away from work details, spend a day or two exploring, then return voluntarily when they got hungry or realized escape was impossible. Camp authorities often didn't even bother with severe punishment. A few days in isolation, then back to routine. The most famous escape from a Texas camp involved Georg Gaertner from Camp Deming, New Mexico. He later lived in Texas. In 1945, he escaped and stayed free for 40 years, living under assumed names in the US until he finally revealed himself in 1985. His story became legendary among former POWs, the man who escaped and built a life in the country that had imprisoned him. but Gärtner was an exception. Most prisoners didn't want to escape. Where they were was better than where they'd been, and likely better than where they'd end up if they returned to Germany. Let's talk about the interactions between prisoners and locals. This is where the story gets complicated and in some ways uncomfortable. The prisoners worked on farms and in communities throughout Texas. They had contact with American civilians, farmers who supervised their work, townspeople who saw them at work sites, and occasionally women who worked in camp administration or lived nearby. Generally, relations were cordial. Texans were practical people. They needed labor, the prisoners provided it. Many farmers came to respect the Germans' work ethic. They were good workers, one farmer near Hien recalled years later. Efficient, didn't complain much, did what you asked, better than some American workers I'd hired. Some friendships developed. Prisoners and farmers would talk during breaks, broken English and broken German, but communication nonetheless. Prisoners would ask about America, farmers would ask about Germany, not politics usually, just life, crops, weather, families. Human connections formed despite the war, despite the circumstances. But there was a darker undercurrent. These were white German prisoners in the segregated South, and they were often treated better than Black Americans. This fact, documented and undeniable, remains one of the most troubling aspects of the POW program. German prisoners could eat in restaurants where Black Americans couldn't. They could sit in parts of buses where Black Americans couldn't. They worked alongside Black laborers, but were housed separately and often paid better. There are documented cases of German POWs being shocked by American racism. Some prisoners, observing segregation, wrote letters expressing disbelief that America preached democracy and freedom while treating its own citizens as second class. The irony wasn't lost on them or on Black Americans who watched enemy soldiers receive better treatment than loyal citizens. One Black newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, ran an editorial in 1944. Our boys in uniform are insulted, humiliated, and even murdered in the South, while Nazi prisoners ride the buses, eat in the restaurants, and are treated with courtesy. This is the democracy we are fighting for. The interaction between German POWs and Black Americans created strange dynamics. Some prisoners, indoctrinated with Nazi racial ideology, expected Black Americans to be inferior, savage, dangerous. Instead, they met educated, skilled, dignified people who treated them with more courtesy than some white Americans did. It challenged their worldview, not enough to erase years of propaganda for all of them, but enough to plant seeds of doubt. Romantic relationships occasionally developed between German prisoners and American women. This was officially forbidden and socially scandalous, but it happened. Young women working in camp administration or living in nearby towns would encounter young German prisoners, many of whom were handsome, polite, educated, and desperately lonely. Some of these relationships were innocent, conversation, exchanged letters. Others became serious. After the war, some German prisoners returned to the US to marry women they'd met during captivity. The US government initially tried to prevent this, but eventually relented. The marriages were controversial. How could an American woman marry an enemy soldier? But the heart doesn't follow geopolitics. Some of these marriages lasted for decades. Others fell apart under the weight of cultural differences and post-war trauma. One such couple, France and Betty, met when France was a prisoner at Camp Huntsville and Betty worked in the camp's administrative office. They married in 1946 after France was repatriated to Germany and then returned to the US as an immigrant. Betty's family disowned her. France struggled with guilt over his wartime service, but they stayed together for 58 years until France's death in 2004. Their story, like many from this era, is both touching and troubling, love crossing battle lines, but also raising questions about loyalty, forgiveness, and what we owe our country versus what we owe ourselves. As the war neared its end, the prisoners faced uncertainty. What would happen to them? Would they be sent home immediately? Would they be tried for war crimes? The answer depended on several factors: their rank, their role in the military, whether they'd been SS or Wehrmacht, and what post-war Germany would look like. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the prisoners in Texas received the news with mixed emotions: relief that the war was over, fear about what came next, grief for their country's destruction and defeat, and for some, continued defiance, hardline Nazis who insisted Germany had been betrayed, not beaten. The repatriation process took time. The first prisoners didn't leave Texas until late 1945. Most went home in 1946. Some weren't repatriated until 1947. The delay was partly logistical, there weren't enough ships, and partly political. The Allies wanted to use POW labor for reconstruction in Europe, clearing rubble, rebuilding infrastructure. German prisoners in American custody were among the last to be sent home, having been treated the best. When they finally returned to Germany, the reverse culture shock was profound. They'd been living in relative comfort in Texas. They returned to a Germany that was devastated, cities in ruins, infrastructure destroyed, food scarce, the economy collapsed, the country divided between Allied occupation zones. Many former prisoners found their homes destroyed, their families scattered or dead. Some prisoners didn't want to return. They'd seen America, the abundance, the freedom, the opportunity. Germany was a wasteland with an uncertain future. Couldn't they stay? Some tried. The legal path was complex but not impossible. Prisoners who'd committed no war crimes and could find American sponsors could eventually immigrate. It took years, but some succeeded. Georg Gaertner, the famous escapee, stayed illegally for decades and eventually became an American citizen. Others returned to Germany, suffered through post-war hardships, and then immigrated legally in the 1950s. Many settled in Texas. The place where they'd been prisoners became their chosen home. They married American women, started businesses, raised children as Americans. The irony was stark. Enemy soldiers who'd fought against America ended up becoming Americans, contributing to the very country they'd once opposed. Today, their descendants live throughout Texas. There are German-American communities in places like Fredericksburg and New Braunfels that include families of former POWs. Some descendants know their grandfather or great-grandfather's story. Others only learn later when old men finally spoke about their past. The stories are usually matter of fact. I was captured in Tunisia, sent to Texas, worked on a farm. The food was good. After the war, I came back. The camps themselves mostly disappeared. After the war, the military no longer needed them. Some were dismantled, the materials sold or reused. Others were converted to other purposes, training facilities, storage, civilian prisons. Very few remain today. Camp Hien, one of the largest, is now a Texas Historical Commission site. Parts of the camp still stand. Some barracks foundations, the water tower, scattered concrete slabs. Interpretive signs tell the story. It's haunting to stand there and imagine 5,000 German soldiers living, working, eating, playing soccer on what's now empty fields. There are memorials. In some Texas towns that hosted camps, local historical societies have erected plaques or small museums. They tell the story of the camps, the prisoners, the strange interlude when Texas hosted thousands of enemy soldiers and in many cases treated them better than America treated its own black citizens. It's a complicated history that doesn't fit neat narratives of good guys and bad guys. The former prisoners themselves, in their later years, often spoke about their Texas experience with nostalgia. Not nostalgia for being prisoners, but for a time when they'd been young, safe from the war, well-fed, and introduced to a country they'd been taught to hate but came to admire. Many kept in touch with the American farmers they'd worked for, exchanging Christmas cards for decades. Some returned to Texas as tourists, visiting the farms where they'd worked, the towns where they'd been held. One former prisoner, Hans Schmidt, returned to Camp Hien in 1985, 40 years after his release. A local reporter interviewed him. Schmidt stood on the overgrown parade ground and said, "This is where I learned that propaganda was lies. We were told Americans were weak, cruel, racially inferior. Then they fed us better than our own army had. They treated us with dignity. They followed rules even when they didn't have to. It changed me. I couldn't go back to Germany after the war and pretend I still believed what the Nazis had taught us. This place, this camp, saved me, not just physically, but mentally. It deprogrammed me." That deprogramming was, in some ways, the most important outcome of the POW program. Thousands of German soldiers returned home having seen America firsthand. They'd seen its wealth, its generosity, its flaws, and its strengths. They became ambassadors of sorts, telling other Germans, "America isn't what we were told. They're not monsters. They're not weak. They're powerful and in some ways decent." This soft power, this people-to-people diplomacy, helped rebuild German-American relations after the war. But we shouldn't romanticize it too much. Not every prisoner left with positive views. Some remained convinced Nazis. Others left with mixed feelings, grateful for the treatment but bitter about the defeat. And the racism they witnessed complicated any narrative of American moral superiority. The prisoners saw both the best and worst of America, generosity and abundance alongside segregation and bigotry. Let's return to the food, because it's central to understanding why this story matters. Food is more than nutrition. It's culture, dignity, power. When America fed German prisoners well, it wasn't just about calories. It was a statement. We have so much abundance that we can feed even our enemies lavishly. We follow rules even when it's inconvenient. We treat you as human beings, not as subhuman as your ideology claimed we would. That statement had power. It undermined Nazi propaganda in ways military victories alone couldn't. A prisoner who'd eaten roast beef and apple pie, who'd been paid for his work, who'd received medical care when sick. That prisoner couldn't easily go home and claim America was barbaric. His lived experience contradicted the ideology. And that food created gratitude, or at least cognitive dissonance. When the war ended and America needed to rebuild Germany as an ally against the Soviet Union, having thousands of former POWs who remembered American treatment positively was valuable. These men became advocates for democracy, for Western values, for cooperation with America. Not all of them, but enough to matter. The food also revealed something about American identity. America in the 1940s defined itself through abundance. While Europe starved, America produced. While others rationed, America thrived. Feeding prisoners well was a flex, a demonstration of American power that was softer than bombs but equally effective in its message. But let's not ignore the dark side. That abundance was built on systems that oppressed others. Black Americans who couldn't eat in the same restaurants as German POWs. Migrant workers who labored alongside prisoners but received worse treatment. Indigenous peoples whose land had been taken to build the very camps that housed enemy soldiers. The story of well-fed German POWs in Texas is also a story of American inequality, of who was considered deserving and who wasn't. And there's the question of whether it was right to treat enemy soldiers so well while American civilians were rationing. Many Americans at the time asked that question. Why should Germans, who'd followed Hitler, who'd fought against us, eat steak and ice cream while American families limited their meat and sugar? The government's answer: Geneva Convention, diplomatic reciprocity, need for labor, satisfied some but not others. There were protests. In some towns, locals complained about the prisoners' treatment. "They're living better than we are," was a common refrain. There were incidents of locals harassing prisoners or refusing to sell goods to camps. Camp commanders had to navigate local politics carefully, balancing prisoner welfare with community relations. The legacy of the POW camps in Texas is complicated. On one hand, it's a story of American generosity, rule following, and successful soft power. On the other hand, it's a story that exposes American hypocrisies and inequalities. Both narratives are true. History is rarely simple. What's undeniable is the impact on the prisoners themselves. Tens of thousands of young German men passed through Texas camps. Most had been ordinary soldiers, not war criminals, not fanatics, just conscripts or volunteers who'd believed their country's cause. Texas changed them, not all of them, not completely, but enough to notice. They went home with stories of abundance, of decent treatment, of a country that didn't match the propaganda they'd been fed. Some became lifelong Americophiles. Some returned to America as immigrants. Some simply carried with them a more nuanced view of the world, less susceptible to propaganda, more skeptical of simple narratives about good and evil. In a small way, the Texas POW camps helped create the foundation for post-war German democracy by exposing young Germans to democratic values and American culture, even if that exposure came through barbed wire. Today, the story is mostly forgotten. Few Americans know that Texas hosted 50,000 German POWs during World War II. Fewer still know about the food, the treatment, the complex dynamics of captivity. The camps are gone, the prisoners are dead, and the memories fade. But the descendants remember. German-American families in Texas, some descended from POWs, preserve the stories. Local historical societies maintain small museums. Researchers continue to document the camps, interviewing the last survivors, preserving letters and photographs. And there are lessons about the power of treating enemies humanely, about how propaganda crumbles when confronted with contradictory experience, about American abundance and American contradictions, about the strange ways history unfolds, enemy soldiers becoming American citizens, captivity leading to immigration, hate transforming into friendship or at least understanding. The prisoners who couldn't believe what Americans served them in Texas camps learned something fundamental. People are complicated, nations are hypocritical, and the world doesn't fit neat categories of good and evil. They learned it through roast beef and apple pie, through soccer games and Christmas carols, through 8-hour workdays and 80-cent wages. They learned it by living it. So when we ask why starving German POWs couldn't believe what Americans served them, we're really asking, why did America choose to treat enemy soldiers so well? The answer is partly strategic, partly legal, partly cultural, and partly just circumstance. America had the food. The Geneva Convention required decent treatment. The prisoners provided needed labor. And somewhere in there was also a belief, not universal, not always consistent, but present, that even enemies deserve basic dignity. Was it right to treat German prisoners better than Black Americans? No. Was it hypocritical to lecture Germany about human rights while maintaining segregation? Absolutely. Does that undermine the positive impact of treating POWs humanely? That's the question each viewer has to answer for themselves. What we can say is this: the German POWs who passed through Texas experienced something they didn't expect. They expected punishment and got relative kindness. They expected starvation and got abundance. They expected brutality and got, if not friendship, at least professional courtesy. And many of them never forgot it. Some never forgave themselves for how well they'd been treated while their families suffered. Others used the experience to rebuild their lives and their understanding of the world. The last survivors are gone now. The camps are ruins or memories, but the story remains of young German soldiers who ate American food in Texas camps and had their worldview shaken. It's a story worth remembering, complicated as it is, because history is never as simple as we want it to be. And sometimes, the most powerful weapon isn't a bomb or a gun, it's a meal served with dignity. Thanks for watching. This story has so many layers. What do you think? Was America right to treat German POWs so well? Should they have done more for Black Americans instead? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this fascinating, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into forgotten history. See you in the next one.